Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Clyde Shirati from Africa Media Australia. On this fifth edition, or sixth rather, edition of Knowledge Tonight, we will be talking to specialists in counseling and trauma. So we will be dealing with that topic today because we think that it is an important topic that deserves to be discussed in our communities. There are a number of people that have been affected by trauma from the beginning. I mean, from the beginning of their arrival in Australia, or even prior to that, because people suffer trauma for a variety of purposes, and then that sometimes even justifies why they have to leave their country and come to Australia. And there's a number of people in our community. There's in some communities, it's largely made of people from a refugee and forced migration background. But trauma is not just for war or calamity. Trauma can also come from personal experience and a variety of things. And today we have COVID. It is causing some level of trauma as well. So we'll talk to Tshimanga Beya, who is a counselor, a specialist, and who's been working with multicultural communities for quite some time. Good evening, sir. How are you today?
I'm okay. Right. Glad to be
All
here.
right. Pastor David Beya, Tshimanga, you are in Sydney and you have been working in the trauma or counseling space for quite some time. Tell us a little bit more about your own story coming to Australia and the work that you've been doing for quite some time.
Okay. I'm from the DRC. I left when it was still called Zaire for theology. Say that again?
It was a long time ago then.
It was a long time ago, yes. I left my country in 1989, I guess, for what was then called Yugoslavia. So I got there before the whole country fell apart. And I went for theological studies. And after completing my first degree, I did very well. And so my professors advised to further my studies in the postgraduate. So one thing led to another, and there was an opening to Australia. So we came, my family and I, to Australia for postgrad theological studies. And it was just when I was completing the studies, that's where this the situation in Congo, became quite unstable, and it was a bit complicated, and so we couldn't go back. And then we applied for permanent residency in Australia. That's how we got it. And so I completed my theological studies in the masters through Moore College, but it's done under the Australian College of Theology, but sponsored by Moore College. And worked as a pastor for a couple of years with the Presbyterians here in Australia. Spent a year in the countryside in Coonabarabran, which was an interesting experience. And then came back to Sydney, where then I worked with the Presbyterians, and then launched a ministry. It was really a church plant in Rockdale. And during that time, I became more interested in trying to see whether there's a juncture between the spiritual side of life with the secular, which then had me branch into studying for counseling, which I did for 2 years. And just when I was completing my studies, there was an opening at Starts in Sydney. And as you know, there are very few Africans in the field of counseling. And because I also did some modules in trauma, I was then a successful applicant and joined Starts since I think 2007, 6 or 7. So it's been a long journey, and at the moment I'm at the management level, but also continuing to see clients.
Okay. We will get into the topic of counseling and trauma in a little while. Let's just stick to that sort of story. That's a section we're introducing in this show where at the same time as we share knowledge, we also want to share a little bit of the story because every one of our stories can inspire. There's you mentioned you came from the DRC. Uh, can you tell us maybe a couple of languages that you know in the DRC and how you say hi in that language?
I actually, because my dad was a chaplain in the army, so we had the advantage of traveling around the country quite a bit. And so I'm from the central part of Congo, the Kasai Oriental,
Hmm.
and I actually studied my primary school in Bukavu, Collège Alfajiri. It was Notre Dame de la Victoire initially, and then became College Alfajiri. And then I spent, I think it was a half a year at Buinti, somewhere there in Bukavu, they call Bagira.
Hmm.
In a school, it was a boarding school under the Protestants, and then from there, my dad was then moved to the western parts, and we're in Kitona, which is a training ground, and we stayed there for a few years, and then he retired, and then which then moved us to back to Kinshasa. So
All right.
I can speak Swahili, Chiluba, Lingala, and a bit of Kikongo.
Wow. So that's fantastic.
Yeah.
One language in the Congo, maybe. Well, let's just take Lingala. How do you say hi in Lingala?
Mbote,
Bote. All right. I'm sure
Mbote
those
Sangonini.
Sangonini, Boni.
Voilà.
Okay, I'm sure there are a lot of Africans who like Lingala because of also because of the influence of the music from the Congo in many African countries. Thank you very much. All right, so you have been in Australia for quite a while. You've been working in this space for quite a while. Um, Tell us what do you think about the way counseling is practiced in Australia, and whether you think it sufficiently caters for the needs of specific communities such as the African Australian community, the multicultural communities.
Yeah, I think counseling is relevant to anyone who can describe himself as a human being. Um, Now, whether it is cut for Africans, I think the it's honest. To be honest, there's some resistance based on maybe misunderstanding or misconception of what counseling is among the African communities, and it could be there's a cultural element to it as well. Whereas
Hmm.
in the context of Africa, when somebody um, has some difficulties, they tend to turn to the elders. They tend to turn to religious leaders. So there's a structure in place for people to go to. Um, but then when it comes to counseling, it's quite a specialist domain.
Hmm.
But people think of it as if just talking. So going to somebody to talk to the person about your problems. But I always say that it's more than talking, because this is about somebody who really understands how the brain, how the body function and react to one's experiences, and is able then to have a scientific view of the impact that has on the individual, and then help the person learn how to better respond or manage in specific different environment, a particularly stressful one. And so Africans, yeah, have this misconception of counseling, and what we find out is that when we are able to kind of educate them and and have them understand what's happening, because one of the aspects of the misunderstanding and misconception, which also fit within the context of the African culture, is that tendency to over spiritualize everything. So someone could just be having a mental health issue, but he sees a spirit, a demon behind it,
Mm.
and who is best placed to deal with that? If not, is the how do you call it, the village doctor,
Yeah.
or the pastor or priest to go and exorcise. But in most of those cases, it really has nothing to do with demons. It just has to do with how the body is constituted and how the body reacts to stressful or life threatening situation. So to go back to your question, yeah, there is some room for improvement, for more education, and that's why we work with community leaders really to try um, and help us pass that message, overcome the resistance, so that as many Africans as can benefit from counseling will then have access to it.
And do you think it's a resistance or perhaps just a lack of understanding of the whole thing? Because the counseling as it is conceptualized and practiced here in Western countries is quite different in the way it is done in many African settings. So it's sort of something that people are not used to, so they're not necessarily resisting, but maybe they don't really understand it, or they don't see the need for it. Is it?
Yeah, that's yeah, it's all part of it. So that resistance is based on the level of understanding of misunderstanding of what it is. But also, I have been in situation in which the resistance itself was caused by, as you said, prior experiences, and oftentimes it's bad experiences of counseling, because some of most of the Africans that you have here who have come migrant as refugees have been in refugee camps. And so in refugee camps, you have somebody who has been given a crash course on how to talk, how to support people in crisis, and not understanding their professional boundaries, venture into deep counseling territory, which then had a negative impact on the individuals. So they come to Australia uh, um, with that as experience. And ever since counseling didn't help me, or I went to counseling, and the next thing I knew was that everybody in the camp knew about my problems and so on. Or I went to counseling, and this counselor did not understand my issues, and so it's almost like with every science. So if you go to a doctor who doesn't know his job, that doctor could do more harm than good.
Mm.
Likewise with counseling. So it's all part of that whole thing. Yes.
And you have been practicing this for quite a while. What are some of the issues that that you encounter a lot from members of the African Australian community? Is there a different from the rest of the community? I mean, obviously, we're not asking you to go into very specifics, but just some ideas what sort of issues that affect Africans in Australia to the point where they need to see a counselor, and they've seen you or some people from your services.
Yeah. One thing that happened with my field in trauma is that you're talking about different dimension. There's the intrapersonal dimension. It's basically counseling is about relationship, really, at the end of the day. There's the intra personal dimension. There's the interpersonal dimension. And so the intrapersonal dimension is how the person is able to relate to self. And interpersonal, how the person is related to the outside world. Now, if you can't relate to yourself well, that in itself compromises your ability to relate to the outside world. And so you will find that among the African, there's this interpersonal issues, conflicts, and almost an ending kind of cycle of conflict within the community, within families. You can even have domestic violence, abuse, and so on, which to me stem from the fact that at the core of how people function are unresolved issues. We could call them trauma, we could call them whatever it is, but that basically diminish people's capacity to relate in a functional way. But now, at some level, you have what we call the acute condition, the chronic condition. When a mental health kind of a state, a condition become chronic, then it has a spillover kind of effect on the body. It could cause blood pressure, it could cause diabetes, and what have you, back problems, and so on, linking with the anxiety. So that's what we call psychosomatic kind of conditions. And so a mental health issue left undealt with could later on lead to more complication, yes, down the line. And so attending to this aspect is very important.
Yeah, but do you see more clients coming to you because of some of the trauma from war? Because we know that there's a significant number of Africans who came to Australia as a result of war. Now, has that been reflected in the number of clients who come to you
Yeah,
for counseling?
yeah, yeah. Honestly speaking, in my experience, very few Africans volunteers come their own volition for counseling, seek for counseling. Most of them are almost like forced by circumstances. So there's a crisis in the family, and the family is falling apart, or there've been this fight at the workplace, and there are some legal issue that the client is facing, and therefore they realize that part of recovery is the plan that you need to attend counseling, and because of their refugee background, then they will come to us. Yeah, and that's quite unfortunate, because some of those issues could have been avoided if the person had taken on the courage to seek
Earlier.
for help. Yeah, and that's part of the misunderstanding, misconceptions. But also there is, from the African, in the African culture, there's a misunderstanding of mental health itself. So when somebody has mental health issue or presented with mental health issues, there's a what's the word I should use? The person is labeled, not only as spiritual problem, but the person is cursed, is the person is crazy, and so on. And this itself stain the reputation of families. So you will have we know of a case where a migrant family struggled with mental health, actually didn't want anybody in the community to know that they were attending counseling. Why? Because everybody will think that there's something wrong with their family.
So there's a stigma that is connected to it.
That's the word I was looking for. Stigma that is attached to mental health, which to some extent even affect how the community relates to the family, to the extent of compromising the chances of somebody marrying into that family, or somebody from the family being allowed to marry someone from within the community because of that stigma.
Absolutely. Now, I know a lot of issues that lead people to seek counseling is a result of the significant amount of stress that people have sort of gone through because of events or relationship or whatever. But isn't also the lifestyle that we live in Australia, for example, or Western countries, that is also contributing a lot compared to what is happening in our African background, where besides war or some natural event that can cause a lot of trauma, but the way people live even the word stress. I remember myself when I came to Australia, and I after about 2 3 years, I was seeing a doctor, and then it was for something else. I had some pain in my stomach. It told me it's about stress, and I said, stress. What is that? It's not that I didn't know what stress meant, but it's sort of that we, in our African way of life, we don't get to think of stress that much. We don't get to think that this is could be stressing me, or this stress could lead to this or that sort of thing. Isn't that also part of the problem?
Yeah, certainly it's part of the problem. Um, that's why initially I spoke about education. But if you are actually implying that the lifestyle in this part of the world is more stressful than back home, that's a different thing.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, you'll find that the African culture is a community-based kind of culture. So the individual is part of the community, and there are tasks that are shared within the community. You may have to go to work. You don't have to worry about your kid back home, because the compound where you're living. As in Africa, they say the child belongs to the community.
The whole village.
So yeah, so that stress is off. And if you need the help quickly, you can always count on somebody, and so on. But in the context of this country, the way the society is set up is that there are so many boundaries, very individualistic, and so you feel like you cut off from everybody else. So you kind of alone, really, when you are
Mhm.
facing difficulties. And that sense of aloneness, I think, it works contrary to the way we are constituted as human beings.
Mhm.
And so when you face all these things, it's quite overwhelming, and no wonder that then one will feel more stressed. And that's quite interesting also, because then when you bring the spiritual dimension to it, which to some extent, I mean, somebody is spiritual in terms of Christianity or Islam, and some of these personal kind of relationship um, religion, you'll find that for those in this country, the church and the fellowship somehow, or to some extent, substitute for the extended family
Family
back.
back home.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so the way they are affected by the stress of everyday living in this country, for instance, will be different.
Okay. Let me just remind those watching. You're watching African Knowledge here on African Media Australia, and today we're speaking about counseling, trauma, and we're speaking with Pastor David Beya, who is a counseling professional practicing in Sydney, and we're talking about how counseling and trauma affect African Australians and how they deal with this situation. Um, so, David, let's talk a little bit about the boundaries between spirituality and counseling, because I think you mentioned that, and it's quite important, because I believe uh, in many ways, many African Australians, although we are not all spiritual, but a great majority of us are spiritual, and we tend to spiritualize many of the issues. So, do you see the spirituality of Africans potentially negatively affecting their understanding of what counseling is, and therefore they are not able to seek that counseling, and that is a problem that needs to be addressed?
Yeah, it's not just spiritualizing; it's really over spiritualizing and becoming superstitious. Whereas something could be just a normal way of the body reacting to a situation. And it's almost like if you miss the target, if you don't diagnose your problem correctly, you're most likely to not be able to deal with it. And so, because you've missed out, identifying what the real problem is, therefore you can't deal with it. So it kind of exacerbates with time. and then it has a spillover kind of effect. Yeah. So I do think that there's a need for a balance, because even as a counselor, I know that some of the presenting issues that we face may have a spiritual root to
Mm-hmm.
them. And so you therefore address them, being mindful of the spiritual root. That's why being a professional counseling means that you are quite aware of your boundaries, because it's against the professional ethics to venture into a territory that you not specialize in.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and that's why there's a provision in counseling referring people out. So there could be a case I'm dealing with that, and that is to do the spiritual roots of the client presenting issues. Then I need to, at that point, admit that this client will be better served by someone, like a pastor or a priest, or the like. And when they deal with it, then I'm able then to come and step in and do the other parts. Um, Yes. I don't know
Okay.
if that answers your question.
Yeah, yeah, I do understand what you're saying. On the other hand, though, isn't there sort of a Western bias that is kind of inherent in the whole concept of counseling?
Bias against.
No, not necessarily against anything, but sort of a Western way of understanding life, or maybe even a scientific way, because counseling, even though it's not exact science, but it kind of leans on that sort of scientific approach of addressing what is wrong or what could be wrong with our minds. So when we're talking about perhaps many African over spiritualizing things, which is understandable in one sense, but on the other sense as well, the whole practice, the whole notion and practice of counseling has that sort of Western or kind of rational and scientific type of bias that doesn't see the other spiritual aspect of things.
Now, counseling itself has evolved over the years, and there have been a lot of there have been an opening to so much. So it started based on the Western worldview, and then slowly the Western worldview proved its limits, and then it's opened up to the Eastern worldview with mindfulness and look, thinking not from a philosophical perspective, not in linear way as is the case in the Western world,
Hmm.
but rather in a circular way, as is in the Western world, in the Eastern world,
Mm.
and part of the African beliefs itself then could be integrated within that context. So it's really about one's values, one worldview, um, and and so the counseling itself as a domain has evolved in that there have been critiques of Western how do you call this uh, approaches and treatment that are based on the Western worldview,
Hmm.
and now you have psychotherapists and counselors who come from the Eastern world with their Eastern kind of worldview, um, critiquing the
It's
Western
Western. Yeah.
based form of psychotherapy.
Yes.
And so a conversation has taken place in such a way that now there have been some integration taking place. Now, I don't think that this same thing has happened in relation to Africans, because if you go basically back to Africa, you'll find that psychotherapists are not many. You don't really find counselors, and psychiatrists themselves are quite few as well.
Hmm.
So that not much has happened from within the African context to kind of become part of this conversation and try to find a way of integrating. So what prompted me actually to study counseling is that felt need for, I kind of felt at some level as if this could be integrated. And so my whole work as a counselor and reading and all that has been searching for that point of integration. Basically, because the end of the day, we react to we interpret and react to our environment based on our value system
Hmm.
and our beliefs.
Yes.
And that in itself will shape, therefore, the impact that these experiences are having on us.
Which means that we as Africans should be able to, I suppose, develop our own counseling toolkit, so to speak, uh, getting what we can get from the broader understanding of both the Western and Eastern worldview, as you pointed, but focusing on our value system and our belief. Is that lacking in the overall counseling literature? Counseling literature.
Yeah. I would say it's lacking. So it's a task that some of us as Africans have to try and do that. And it's only one that can be done successfully by people who have been able to kind of grasp the Western view of counseling and how they inform the counseling principles and theories and so on. And then we go then open up and learn from. That's what I think is that it will take a lot of humility on our parts going back to Africa with our degrees, as to go to the old ladies in the villages, the old men in the villages, and learn from them how they dealt with some issues. What were the principles that were informing them? And so whenever they fall short, then we can kind of supply. For instance, when it is based on
Superstition.
superstition, or over spiritualized, then we can bring a scientific understanding to it. But you will be quite surprised that there are many things that are done even in the context of Africa in dealing with community issues that are quite based on principles that are quite sound, that could have a scientific undergirding, but it's not. No one has taken time to kind of develop them, research, develop them, spell them out in a systematic way, as is often the case in the Western scientific world.
Absolutely. Maybe our universities, that's a job universities should do, to get students out there to start looking into the depth of African wisdom and values and beliefs, and build a body of counseling knowledge that can be used to help Africans. So that's you think that that's the job that needs to be done?
I strongly believe there's a great need for that. There's an opportunity. The African culture and value is so rich that that disconnect sometimes. As we started this show by talking about the resistance and so on, which is based on misunderstanding, misinformation, could be cleared by allowing that. Like somebody say in French, I don't know who said it. They talk about the Western and the developed world. I think it was Cedar Senghor,
Hmm.
who said the meeting between the West and the others is more of the meeting du donner du recevoir.
Yeah.
So it means
Even.
that each one of us bring in something, which means that we
Mhm.
have something that we can also bring in
Offer.
this conversation. Yeah. So I
Abs-
believe that the same thing that has happened between the Eastern world and the Western world in the field of counseling and psychotherapy, or even psychology, need to happen between the West and the South as well.
Yeah, and perhaps in that whole circle have the Western, the Eastern, and the South, which is us and all that sort of thing. But then also, actually, before I go to the next, let me just remind those watching, please, we encourage you to make comments and ask questions. I can see some questions there from OG TV. I think if I've got some questions that I'll put to the guest tonight. The rest of you who haven't yet made any comments or haven't asked any question, please, we encourage you to do that, and we'll see if we can get them answered. Now, coming back to the same issue about that lack of literature and sort of African knowledge to be integrated into the scientific approach of counseling. It means that those who are doing counseling in Australia are not well equipped to be able to appropriately address the counseling needs of the Africans to some extent, isn't it?
Yeah. I would say that, because at the end of the day, if to be able to communicate sensibly to somebody, I need to understand that person's frame of reference. I need to understand, because as a language, really, there's connotations, so many things. And if I'm not able to step into that person's world, I won't be effective in trying to support that person. Because at the end of the day, it's not my meaning of the world, it is his meaning of the world that is actually shaping how he's interacting with his environment.
Which also explains why many Africans have the feeling or the impression that they won't get much help from counseling, because we've seen actually that in some areas, counseling has actually made things worse for many Africans. I know I've had some conversation previously with friends, and there's a feeling that, for example, when it comes to marriage issues, when a couple goes to a counseling, given the framework of how counseling is practiced in Australia and many Western countries, they end up actually worse than when they started.
Yeah. That's why there have been talks of providing culturally aware, kind of culturally informed practice and intervention. So it's a recognition of that problem and the abuses that have happened. I can tell you of a case that was allocated of an African family that was falling apart, and the couple actually blamed the professional person who was supporting them, and so I'm just trying to tell the story without telling too much. But the family fell apart, and eventually the children were removed from the couple, and eventually one of them ended up in jail, arrested, and that only exacerbated the mental health issues that the parents were having. And so it caused a lot of trauma to resurface. It was a quite delicate kind of situation. But that's just an example of somebody, a professional in the Western context, not understanding the value of family and community, and how for African they don't really function as individuals as such, and the fact that there are hierarchies within the family, and it has been working for them for years, and so they come to Australia only to function in a system that is totally different. The framework is not community in that context, more of the individual. And so some of them even would regret coming to Australia. I've heard a few clients saying that, I really regret coming to Australia. I should have stayed in Africa with my family. If I'd done that, maybe today I would still have my children. I would still have my family.
And do you also feel there's a bit of a resistance from the government or any of these services, including yours, where that and when I say yours, I don't mean you as a person, but the organization you work for, where that the need to incorporate the African framework into that counseling is not sufficiently cut for. It's like maybe it's too hard, and we will just use what we know, what we have.
Maybe depend on the organization, but that starts the reason awareness of the need for multicultural kind of approach and informed intervention. That's why when I started that starts, they were having bicultural counselors. So because Africans were not really much in the field, what they did was to employ Africans, who were educated and then train them in counseling, so that at least to ensure that cultural awareness will be there
Mm,
in practice. Yeah, and so that we have by cultural workers, professional, um, for that reason. But see, the way I came to start was that I was already trained. I had a postgrad degree in counseling, and so I was not employed as a bicultural counselor as such. But the advantage is that I'm from an African background, so I understand these things. So I was able to bridge with some clients who have come. But there's still a lot of work to be done to kind of overcome this resistance to
okay.
counseling that I mentioned earlier.
All right. And I suppose let's talk about the situation now with this COVID crisis that has been ongoing for quite some time. Do you see that potentially causing significant amount of trauma that people may need assistance with?
Uh, the COVID causing trauma, trauma has to do with how the body respond and react to life-threatening experiences. Um, and so,
Maybe stress. Maybe trauma is not the right word for this, but the whole amount of stress that is generated as a result of the multiple facets of this crisis, can that
yeah,
lead to?
but your question is quite valid because you see, the COVID 19 itself, unless it is experienced by an individual as threatening that person's integrity, a life threatening experience, then it can lead to trauma. Other than that, it is stressful for everybody because what you have here, we are what we call social being. So our brain, we have a social brain. Our health, we are healthy when we interact, when we are active.
Mm,
So in isolation, we kind of die out, we shrink, we do not flourish.
mhm,
It's just like a plant that is not watered, no sun to it, and so on. So this is just the basic way the body functions. And so lockdown itself, it's quite strict, is bound to create, mental health issues. And so we've been, having clients who came to Australia as traumatized, who have managed somehow to recover and were functioning quite a bit. And then Australia is hit by COVID. They're put into lockdown. That in itself caused unresolved trauma issues to surface or resurface.
mm,
And so those people do not cope well, are really struggling so much. And so much to the extent that you will have people presenting with suicidal ideation, uh, you know, high level of anxiety, depression, and all that, um, and not really coping well. Yeah. So this COVID situation is only not only creating, but it's also exacerbating
yeah,
existing mental
existing
health
problems.
issues.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Let me start taking some of the questions before we go into the last part of the show, where we're going to talk about tools and tips to help people who may potentially be facing some of these issues that you can help them with as a professional in some way, because I know it's difficult to do counseling on on a show like this. A question from one of the people watching says, how do you answer an individual who says, God will protect me, God will heal my trauma, God is my counselor?
Okay. Um, how do I answer that person? So
That's
I
right.
answer the person from where they are at. So for my approach in counseling is to meet somebody where they are at, and I'll try to explore what that means for the person.
Mhm.
Um, and part of trying to explore what that means for the person is hoping to get to a place where the person can decide whether they have a right appreciation of an understanding of the nature of the problem they are having
Mhm.
or not. Um, yeah, but there is this whole issue about faith and trust, um, that need to be, how can I say, further discussed.
Mhm.
My understanding of faith, I think you read some of my posts. My understanding of faith is that it has to have a substance. It is not wishful thinking. So if God said, trust me with that, I'm gonna do this, I done that to you specifically, then you have a word, that's a substance. The word becomes a substance upon which you build that thing. But for you just to come and say, because I believe in God generally, I will not take responsibility for my problem, God will fix it. Then I'll say that person does not understand faith, does not understand how that function, and also that person may not have a good understanding of the problem that they are dealing with and how to fix it. And maybe in other show we might look into this. You know why some enlightened African people blame Christianity for the situation in Africa, and
Mhm.
that is due to this kind of misunderstanding, as if God, trusting in God means not taking responsibility. My
Mhm.
understanding is that my trust in God is what makes me take responsibility. Because I
Mm.
believe that by creating me is endow me with the capacity to be able to solve some of my problems,
Take care of your
and
life right here on
yeah,
earth.
take care of my life and so on. Yeah.
Absolutely, but then I guess it's a tricky frontier, really. It's a tricky line from the spirituality into counseling, because I suppose it's a territory, you know, both the spiritual side of things can help to deal with the stress and trauma that somebody may need counseling for. At the same time, there is, it doesn't necessarily eliminate the help that a professional counselor can bring into the whole mix, isn't it? Isn't it
Yeah,
what the
yeah.
problem?
Again, even when we're talking about spirituality and so on, the a counseling definition of spirituality is quite different from the common, African understanding of spirituality.
Yeah.
For counseling and psychology, spirituality has to do with this immaterial aspect of our existence, and so it's more about meaning, about the non-physical aspect of how we function, of how we interact with our environment, to the extent that even our values become part of that aspect of our spirituality. Whereas the common African man, when he talks about spirituality, is thinking of God. So in counseling, spirituality doesn't necessarily mean God. So
Mm.
if there is a God, that when we say that this is just a representation that someone has of a higher being that help him deal with his own anxieties and so on. But for the African man, thinking of spirit, God in the context of spirituality is a person, a
Hmm.
spiritual being,
Yeah.
above my world, that makes him transcendent. And because he's transcendent, then he can step into my world and help me out.
Mm.
Whereas from a counseling perspective, that's not really the understanding and definition of spirituality.
And then, people, some would argue we don't have to take that understanding from counseling because it's one that comes from a worldview that is obviously different from the very nature of the spiritual understanding that the person has about God. Because science or the Western worldview that is embedded through the knowledge that is used to build a framework and a toolkit for counseling is one that is already biased in that existence of God. That's potentially is a different question with a whole lot of things that can be said. Another question here is that what are your thoughts on dreams and visions? And this actually leads me to think, because in the African psychology, dreams have quite a lot of value, and people sort of put a lot of um, I would say they put a lot of importance to dreams, and they think it has some sort of message uh, that they sort of trust and believe in. Not always, but to a great deal, which may affect the way they see things and whether they need counseling or not. What are your thought about this whole thing about dreams and visions that is quite prevalent in many African communities?
Yeah. It's all depend on whether one sees dreams as revealing, predictive, and so on. But from a counseling perspective, a psychotherapist perspective, the Freud's own understanding of dream, it was that it's a window into one's subconscious, or the unconscious part of an individual, so that dreams speak more about the individual, and that the meaning of the dream is within the individual. So when I sit down with a client, he's telling me, I've been dreaming about all this and so on. What we do is trying to analyze that dream. I'm not coming to tell the person that this is what I think it means, but I'm asking the person from within your own culture, what does this imagery represent? What is
Hmm.
the meaning of this and that? But I must tell you honestly, 98% of my clients have come to realize through dream analysis that it was actually talking about the situation they were in. So it was revealing something about them rather
Hmm.
than the world out there or something ominous about to happen. And
Mm.
so there's a value in that. But having said that, coming from a Christian perspective, I also know that there are what they call prophetic dreams,
Mhm.
which are quite predictive or revealing of something that could not be known from below. It has to be the knowledge that had to have come from God Himself, imparting it to an individual. So that there are people who dream about something and then they see it happening. But also, in Ecclesiastes in the Bible, it talks about dreams being born out of many cares and worries.
Mm.
And so it is all that we take into context when it comes to dream. So I would really say to people, when you dream, don't just jump to the conclusion that your dream is telling you something about your future, something from God, but you need to take time to analyze it.
Okay. And what do you think is the reason why there hasn't been so many Africans in this field of counseling in Australia as well as more broadly? Because Although I'm not in the field, but I haven't seen many books, for example, written by Africans in relation to this. Why is it? Because Africans in general are not interested?
That's what will be the simple answer, that it's there's a lack of interest on the part of Africa. But if you also think in terms of opportunity for employment, or in the context of Africa itself,
Mm,
employability issue.
yeah,
Uh, so unless somebody is doing it really out of um, scientific curiosity, but he has other means of surviving,
yeah,
that would make sense. But you do it, then you go back, you realize that the environment is not conducive for it. Just become jobless. But I think that should not really stop us. I do, as I said before, that I'm thinking about that there must be a point of integration. Whereas I can imagine a context of a church, booming and growing church in Africa, for instance. Somebody could be a member of that church, and get involved into the counseling, um, ministry of that church, but add a scientific dimension to it. We've tried that here in Sydney with Living Word Church International, and I see it does work, but the context here is different.
yeah.
But there's room for that. It's just a matter of education at the end of the day, and then maybe we'll see some more openness. But that's what I think accounts for the fact that not many Africans are in this field.
Okay. Before we finish, let's talk about tools and tips. What would you be able to provide to people out there about maybe some few techniques that they may use when dealing with a lot of stress, or going through some sort of trauma, that they can use to minimize the chance of them needing even more help later?
Yeah. One thing to understand is that trauma itself diminishes the capacity to tolerate stress. Um, it's also very important to understand that our bodies are not made to function under stress, undue stress, so that the impact of it is almost negative on the body.
Mm,
But also, I like to help my client understand that stress itself is a message. I think of symptoms as the language of the body.
mm,
I always say to my client, if you feel hungry, if you feel some sensation in your stomach, I ask them, when you feel hungry, what kind of sensation you have? They say this or that. I say, okay. Now, if you are to feel your throat, drying and so on, what does that mean? Oh, I need to drink
drink
some
water.
water. I say yes.
Mhm.
So that's how the body functions through what we call symptoms. So it's the language of the body, and and so we should not neglect what the body is telling us. And in the event of stress, it's actually calling us to make some changes.
Mhm.
And so it's through stress you have the symptoms. You need to step back and look at your lifestyle as a whole, and what is it that you are overdoing? In what area are you having unnecessary worries and so on? And then try to adjust. Um, with the anxiety, um, it's all about the body metabolism, really the way the brain function. Um, and so somebody would say, "I'm anxious." We'll ask the person, "What makes you say you are anxious?" The person will say, "Oh, I can't sleep. I can't concentrate. I'm tensed up, and so on." So basically, what I said to my client is that you got to understand that these sensations themselves start with the fact that your brain perceives that you're not safe, and that's quite subjective. And then, so because you're not safe, the brain is responsible to help you be safe. So the brain will
Remind.
react, yeah, in such a with the flight or the fight kind of response, getting your heart to start beating faster, and so set the blood throughout your muscles, so you are ready to act, or by fighting or running away.
Mm-hmm.
Now you need to be able to kind of bring your body back to what we call a state of relaxation.
Mm-hmm.
And the way you can do that is by controlling your breathing. So you can reduce your heartbeat by controlling your breathing. So diaphragmatic breathing, and we call deep breathing, and so on. And so when you are able to then reduce your heartbeat, that means therefore that also the more blood, not more blood will not be pumped to your muscles, and so it gives that sense of relaxation.
Mm-hmm.
So the key really in terms of dealing with that feeling of anxiety is that work on your breathing. If you can get yourself to breathe deeply from what we call your timing or your diaphragm, as opposed to from your chest. If you can get yourself to breathe deeply, then you can also relax your body. When you relax your body, then the brain get the message, because the brain also communicate with
In a loop.
the body, the brain, and so on. It's two ways communication.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can get your body to relax, yeah, then your body send a message back to the brain, say it's safe, and the brain register that it's safe, and then that mechanism, natural mechanism, then will be undone, and then you feel relaxed. This is very important also for those who at some point start feeling hyperventilated, panic attacks, and building up and so on. It's again through your breathing you can get yourself to kind of relax. This is very important because the brain doesn't make a difference between your experience, your real experience, your imagination and your thoughts.
Mm.
That's just a data. So when you think, the brain takes it to be real. So if
Mm.
you're thinking that you are not safe, the brain takes it to mean that I'm not safe, and then it triggers this reaction in your body that you describe it as anxiety. So when you're able to reduce that, then the brain can create an association between that thought and the feeling of relaxation. But at some point, it can get a little bit complicated that you need professional people to
Assistance.
help you.
Yeah.
But the basic approach is just that you can relax your body through breathing. And so if you
Yeah.
have an anxious brain, it means you can't learn. It doesn't release your creativity. So you need to relax your brain to be able to concentrate.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Maybe we will use another opportunity. You can come back, and the platform is open for more conversations of this type, and be able to share the knowledge to help many people maybe having some issues or simply want to learn, so that they will be more equipped to not only help themselves but also help others in the community. Obviously, we know that there are a lot of issues that are happening in the society today, and that is conducive to a lot of potential um, stressful or traumatic issues that may require that people will need help. So we will be having uh, these conversations here on Africa Media Australia to try and help in this difficult and challenging time that we're living in. Pastor David Beya, we want to thank you for your time to African Knowledge here at Africa Media Australia. We
Having
appreciate
me.
you being available, and we hope you'll be available next time to talk more. Perhaps we're going to go deeper into that tools and tips sort of section to trying to help people with some type of scenario and see how we go. I want to thank those who've been watching and commenting and asking questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't get every question answered. We will try to perhaps use some of those questions for the next session that we may be having with Reverend David Beya. Thank you again, and until next time, stay blessed.
Thank you.